My beloved child. Do not move past these words too quickly. Something hidden beneath the silence is beginning to surface, and what you are about to hear may change the way you understand everything that happened between you and the person your heart still remembers. Pause here for a moment, because there was a moment you never witnessed, a moment when the walls they had built around their certainty suddenly began to collapse. They had convinced themselves they understood you. They thought they knew why you acted the way you did, why you became quiet, why you stepped back, why certain words were left unsaid. But recently, something reached them that challenged the story they had been carrying, and when the truth finally settled into their heart, they could no longer pretend they had been right about you. You did not see the moment it happened. There was no audience. No dramatic confession. No message arriving on your phone telling you what had changed. From your side, everything may have appeared exactly the same. The silence remained silent. The distance still looked like distance. Yet behind that silence, their heart was going through something they never expected. They remembered something about you, something small enough that anyone else might have forgotten it, and suddenly the memory carried an entirely different meaning. It became the first thread they pulled, and once they pulled it, the entire story they had told themselves began unraveling. For a long time, they believed your silence meant you did not care enough. They mistook your restraint for indifference. They interpreted the way you protected your heart as proof that you could walk away without feeling anything. They saw only what was visible and never asked themselves what might have been happening underneath. But what they did not understand was how many times you chose peace instead of explaining yourself again. They did not see the conversations you replayed privately. They did not know how many words you swallowed because you were afraid that speaking from pain would only create more pain. They never realized that sometimes the person who becomes quiet is not the person who cares least. Sometimes it is the person who has already tried to say too much and has become exhausted from feeling misunderstood. And this is where everything changed. Something reminded them of one particular moment between you. At first, it seemed ordinary. Perhaps it was a sentence you once said, a look you gave them, a moment when you tried to explain yourself and they were too emotionally guarded to truly listen. They remembered the expression on your face differently this time. Before, they had interpreted it through suspicion, frustration, pride, or fear. But now they saw something else. They saw hurt. They saw patience. They saw someone trying desperately not to turn love into another argument. That realization did not arrive gently. It struck them in the quiet. They were alone with their thoughts when the question came, what if I was wrong? They tried to dismiss it. Pride often fights hardest when truth first knocks on the door. They reminded themselves of everything they had previously believed. They replayed their own reasoning. They searched through old memories as though they could find evidence that would protect them from admitting they had misunderstood you. But something strange happened. Every memory they examined began revealing another side of you. The things they once called distance began looking like self-protection. The things they once called stubbornness began looking like boundaries. The things they once called coldness began looking like someone desperately trying to remain composed. And the moments they once believed proved you did not care began showing them exactly how deeply you did. This was when their emotions became difficult to contain. Not because someone told them they should regret what happened. Not because anyone forced them to reconsider. Their own heart became the witness against the version of the story they had created. They began remembering the ways you showed up when nobody was applauding you. The patience you offered when you could have walked away. The understanding you gave when you were not receiving the same understanding in return. They remembered moments when you could have embarrassed them, exposed their weakness, or used their vulnerability against them, yet you chose not to. And suddenly they understood something painful. You had been protecting their dignity even while your own heart was hurting. That realization broke through something inside them. Their eyes filled before they even understood why. They tried to control it because they were not expecting emotion to rise so quickly. They looked away as though looking somewhere else could stop the memories. But another memory came. Then another. And another. They remembered a time you asked them a simple question and they answered defensively because they assumed you were judging them. Now they realized you had only been trying to understand. They remembered a time you became quiet after something they said. They had assumed you were being difficult. Now they remembered the softness disappearing from your face, and they understood that they had wounded you more deeply than they knew. They remembered how you sometimes gave them space even when what you truly wanted was reassurance. They had mistaken that space for emotional distance. Now they realized you were trying not to pressure someone you loved. And then came the memory that changed the atmosphere completely. There was a moment when you could have defended yourself fully, but you did not. You knew something they did not know. You understood something about the situation that could have cleared your name in their eyes, yet you remained quieter than they expected. For a long time, they interpreted your silence as guilt or lack of interest. But now, pieces were beginning to connect. They realized your silence may have had nothing to do with weakness. You were protecting something. Perhaps their feelings. Perhaps someone else's privacy. Perhaps the fragile peace surrounding the situation. Whatever the reason, they suddenly understood that you carried the heavier burden because you did not want everything around you to become more damaged. That is when the tears came. Quietly. Not the kind of tears meant to be seen. Not the kind someone performs for sympathy. These were the tears that appear when the heart realizes it cannot return to yesterday and change how it responded. They covered their face for a moment. And the thought that hurt them most was not simply, "I was wrong." It was, "They were hurting, and I made them feel alone in it." My child, there are realizations that arrive like whispers, and there are realizations that divide life into before and after. This was becoming the second kind. Because once they saw your pain differently, they could no longer comfortably return to their old assumptions. But there was something else they discovered, something they were not prepared for. They began asking themselves why they had been so willing to believe the worst interpretation of your actions. That question opened a deeper door. They realized some of their judgment had never truly been about you. It came from old disappointments, old betrayals, old promises someone else had broken. Old wounds they had carried into your connection without recognizing them. Someone before you may have taught them that closeness eventually becomes abandonment. Someone may have made them suspicious of kindness. Someone may have given them affection and then suddenly withdrawn it. And without meaning to, they began looking at you through the shadow of what another person had done. You were being judged for a crime your heart never committed. When you needed space, they remembered someone who disappeared. When you asked difficult questions, they remembered someone who manipulated them. When you became emotional, they remembered chaos from their past. When you loved them sincerely, part of them waited for the hidden condition because they had learned to distrust anything that felt too real. But you were not that person. And now they knew it. This truth made their regret deeper because they realized you had been fighting an invisible battle from the beginning. You were trying to love someone who sometimes reacted not to what you were doing, but to what someone else had once done to them. And you could not understand why your intentions kept being misunderstood. There were times you questioned yourself because of it. You wondered whether you had explained things poorly. Whether you had loved too deeply. Whether you had expected too much. Whether you should have said something differently, waited longer, spoken sooner, stayed quieter, or tried harder. But there was no perfect sentence that could have healed a wound they had not yet recognized inside themselves. They needed their own awakening. And it has begun. Yet listen carefully, because this is where the story becomes more complicated. Their tears were not only about regret. Something else surfaced while they were remembering you. They realized they missed a version of themselves that existed around you. This surprised them. They had spent so much time thinking about what went wrong that they had forgotten what went right. But suddenly they remembered how naturally certain conversations flowed. They remembered moments when you made them laugh without trying. They remembered the unusual calm they sometimes felt around you. They remembered how you noticed things other people overlooked. Perhaps you remembered a detail they mentioned weeks earlier. Perhaps you asked whether they were okay when everyone else believed their smile. Perhaps you could sense when something was wrong without demanding an explanation. At the time, they did not fully appreciate those moments because people often understand the value of emotional safety only after it becomes absent. Now the absence was speaking loudly. They began comparing. Not deliberately at first. They simply noticed that conversations with others did not reach the same places. People heard their words, but you had often heard what was beneath them. Others might notice when they became quiet, but you understood different kinds of silence. You knew when they needed space and when they secretly hoped someone would stay. And suddenly the question changed. It was no longer only, was I wrong about them? It became, what did I lose because I was wrong? That question frightened them. Not with danger, but with possibility. Because regret is one thing when you believe the past is finished. It becomes something entirely different when your heart begins wondering whether the story could have unfolded another way. They stood at the edge of that thought longer than they expected. What if I had listened? What if I had asked instead of assumed? What if I had trusted what they showed me instead of letting fear interpret everything? What if they were not leaving me? What if they were waiting for me to meet them halfway? And then came the most difficult question. What if they stopped waiting? They were not prepared for the ache that followed. Because for the first time, they imagined you no longer looking backward. They imagined you healing. They imagined you laughing without wondering whether they would ever understand. They imagined someone else recognizing immediately what they had taken too long to see. Someone noticing your loyalty without questioning it. Someone respecting your boundaries instead of calling them distance. Someone listening when you speak instead of preparing an argument. Someone looking into your eyes and recognizing the depth that they once misunderstood. That image disturbed them more than they wanted to admit. And this is where pride began losing its grip. For so long, pride had told them there would always be more time. More time to explain. More time to apologize. More time to return. More time to say the words they kept postponing. But now they began understanding that time does not remain still simply because someone is emotionally unprepared. People heal. People grow. People change. Doors that remain open for a long time can eventually close quietly. And the person standing outside may not hear the moment the lock turns. My beloved child, you must understand something important about your own journey here. Their realization does not mean you must stop your life and wait. It does not mean every unanswered question must suddenly become your responsibility again. Your healing is not a waiting room. Your worth does not increase because someone finally recognizes it. You were worthy before their realization. You were worthy while they misunderstood you. You were worthy during the silence. And you remain worthy regardless of what they choose to do next. But something inside them is changing. That is the hidden movement beneath this story. They have begun seeing the difference between losing someone because love was impossible and losing someone because fear distorted what love was trying to become. Those are not the same loss. One creates acceptance. The other creates questions. And they now have questions they cannot silence. They started revisiting conversations in their mind, almost hearing your words again. Certain sentences that once irritated them now sound different. A phrase you repeated suddenly makes sense. Something you tried to warn them about now appears less like criticism and more like concern. They remembered one moment in particular when you said something simple, something they barely responded to at the time. You were trying to tell them what you needed. Not something impossible. Not perfection. Not constant attention. You wanted honesty. Consistency. The feeling that you were standing beside someone rather than constantly trying to convince them that your heart was genuine. They did not understand how tired you were becoming. You were not tired of loving them. You were tired of defending the fact that you loved them. There is a difference. And now they finally see it. That truth sat heavily inside them. They remembered how many times you tried to make peace after misunderstandings. They remembered how often you softened your tone even when you were hurt. They remembered the way you gave chances without announcing that you were giving them. And something painful became clear. You had already forgiven things they never apologized for. That realization humbled them. Because they had believed they were the one protecting themselves from being hurt, but suddenly they could see how often you had protected the connection from their fear. They whispered something into the quiet. Your name may have been part of it. Perhaps they said, "I didn't understand." Perhaps they simply whispered, "I'm sorry." There was nobody there to hear it. But they said it anyway. And sometimes the first apology is spoken to an empty room because the heart must practice honesty before the mouth becomes brave enough to speak directly to the person it wounded. Yet there was still one thing stopping them. One fear they had not overcome. They did not know whether you would believe them now. They imagined reaching out. They imagined typing something and deleting it. They imagined hearing your voice. They imagined the silence after saying your name. Every possibility carried hope and uncertainty together. What would they even say? How could they explain that their perspective had changed without sounding as though they expected you to erase everything that happened? How could they tell you they were wrong without placing the responsibility for their regret onto your shoulders? They knew, "I miss you," would not be enough. Because missing someone does not repair what misunderstanding damaged. They knew, "I was confused," would not be enough. Confusion may explain behavior, but it does not erase its consequences. And they knew, "Can we start again," might be too large a request before offering the truth. So they remained still. But not peacefully. Their heart was beginning to push against the silence they had once chosen. And then something unexpected happened. Someone around them noticed. They had been trying to hide the emotional shift, but someone close enough could sense something was different. Perhaps it was the way they suddenly became quiet when your name appeared in conversation. Perhaps they stared too long at something that reminded them of you. Perhaps they were asked a simple question and their expression revealed more than their answer. What happened? They tried to avoid it. Nothing. But the person did not believe them. And after a pause, your soulmate admitted something they had not said aloud before. "I think I was wrong about them." Saying it aloud changed everything. Thoughts can hide inside the mind. Spoken words become real. The person listening did not immediately answer. That silence made your soulmate nervous. Because they expected either agreement or reassurance. Instead, the person asked a question. A question so simple that it pierced directly through every excuse. Did they ever actually give you a reason not to trust them, or were you afraid because of what happened before them? Your soulmate froze. Because somewhere inside, they already knew the answer. They tried to remember the evidence. Not feelings. Not assumptions. Not imagined possibilities. Actual evidence. And the more honestly they searched, the more uncomfortable the truth became. You had not betrayed them in the way their fear suggested. You had not become the person their imagination warned them about. They had treated possibilities like facts. They had allowed fear to write conclusions before love had finished speaking. The person sitting with them saw the answer in their face. And then came another question. Do you think they knew you didn't trust them? That one hurt even more. Because suddenly your soulmate remembered your eyes. They remembered the way your energy changed when you realized your sincerity was being questioned. They remembered how you stopped explaining certain things. Not because you had something to hide. Because being endlessly questioned had begun making you feel as though your truth would never be enough. And they cried again. This time, there was no pretending. The person beside them did not interrupt. Some realizations need silence around them. And your soulmate finally admitted something they had resisted for a long time. I think I pushed them away while waiting for them to leave. Those words changed the room. Because there it was. The hidden truth. They had feared abandonment so deeply that they had unconsciously created distance first. They wanted reassurance but sometimes responded to reassurance with suspicion. They wanted closeness but became guarded when closeness arrived. They wanted you to stay but sometimes behaved as though your presence could not be trusted. And you had been trying to understand a contradiction they themselves did not understand. My child, there are moments when a person finally sees their own pattern, and once they see it clearly, they cannot unsee it. That moment had arrived. But the person sitting beside them was not finished. They asked one more question. What are you going to do about it? Your soulmate looked down. For several seconds, there was no answer. Because regret is emotional, but action requires courage. They could cry. They could remember. They could wish things had happened differently. But eventually, truth demands a decision. Would they remain hidden behind pride and allow you to believe they never understood? Or would they risk vulnerability and tell you what had finally become clear? Their hand moved toward their phone. Then stopped. Their heart began beating faster. Your name was closer than they expected. A few movements of their fingers could open a door they had been afraid to touch. But before they did, they remembered something else. Something you once said near the end of a difficult conversation. At the time, they barely understood its meaning. Now the words returned with startling clarity. You had not asked them to chase you. You had not demanded a grand gesture. You had simply wanted them to see you accurately. To stop making you fight against assumptions. To meet the real person in front of them rather than the person their fear imagined. And now they finally could. But they did not know whether they had realized it too late. Their finger hovered over your name. They opened something. Perhaps an old conversation. Perhaps a photograph. Perhaps a message they had read many times without truly hearing what your heart was saying. And as they looked again, something caught their attention. A detail they had overlooked. A sentence. A timestamp. A small piece of the past that suddenly connected to the exact misunderstanding that had separated you. They read it once. Then again. Their expression changed. Because this was not merely another memory. This was confirmation. Confirmation that during the very moment they believed you had stopped caring, you had actually been doing something they never knew about. Something for them. Something you never told them. And when they finally understood why you kept it secret, they whispered your name through tears and reached for the phone again. This time, they were not opening an old memory. They were about to do something they had been afraid to do for far too long. But just before they could take that step, another message appeared on their screen. They stared at it. Their face went completely still. Because the person who sent that message knew something about you, something connected to the misunderstanding, and what they were about to reveal would force your soulmate to confront the one truth they were never prepared to hear.